Chapter 1, Part 2 of The 8 Strokes of the Clock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. The 8 Strokes of the Clock by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 1, Part 2. Half an hour later, Hortense, Daniel, and Rénine left the Château de Halingre. Before their departure, they had gone as far as the ivy-grown tower, the remains of an old donjon keep more than half demolished. The inside was empty. There seemed to have been a way of climbing to the top, at a comparatively recent period, by means of wooden stairs and ladders, which now lay broken and scattered over the ground. The tower backed against the wall which marked the end of the park. A curious fact, which surprised Hortense, was that Prince Rénine had neglected to pursue any more minute inquiry, as though the matter had lost all interest for him. He did not even speak of it any longer, and in the inn at which they stopped and took a light meal in the nearest village, it was she who asked the landlord about the abandoned chateau. But she learned nothing from him, for the man was new to the district and could give her no particulars. He did not even know the name of the owner. They turned their horses' heads towards La Marèze. Again and again Hortense recalled the squalid sight which had met their eyes. But Rénine, who was in a lively mood and full of attentions to his companion, seemed utterly indifferent to those questions. "But after all," she exclaimed impatiently, "we can't leave the matter there. It calls for a solution." "As you say," he replied, "a solution is called for. Monsieur Rossini has to know where he stands, and you have to decide what to do about him." She shrugged her shoulders. "He's of no importance for the moment. The thing to-day—" "Is what?" "Is to know what those two dead bodies are. Still, Rossini can wait. But I can't. You have shown me a mystery which is now the only thing that matters. What do you intend to do?" "To do?" "Yes. There are two bodies. You'll inform the police, I suppose." "Gracious goodness!" he exclaimed, laughing. "What for?" "Well, there's a riddle that has to be cleared up at all costs, a terrible tragedy." "We don't need any one to do that." "What? Do you mean to say that you understand it?" "Almost as plainly as though I had read it in a book, told in full detail, with explanatory illustrations. It's all so simple." She looked at him in askance, wondering if he was making fun of her. But he seemed quite serious. "Well?" she asked, quivering with curiosity. The light was beginning to wane. They had trotted at a good pace, and the hunt was returning as they neared La Marèze. "Well," he said, "we shall get the rest of our information from people living roundabout, from your uncle, for instance, and you will see how logically all the facts fit in. When you hold the first link of a chain, you are bound, whether you like it or not, to reach the last. It's the greatest fun in the world." Once in the house, they separated. On going to her room, Hortense found her luggage and a furious letter from Rossini, in which he bade her good-bye and announced his departure. Then Rénine knocked at her door. "Your uncle is in the library," he said. "Will you go down with me? I've sent word that I'm coming." She went with him. He added: "One word more. This morning, when I thwarted your plans and begged you to trust me, I naturally undertook an obligation towards you, which I mean to fulfill without delay. I want to give you a positive proof of this." She laughed. "The only obligation which you took upon yourself was to satisfy my curiosity." "It shall be satisfied," he assured her gravely, "and more fully than you can possibly imagine." Monsieur d'Aigleroche was alone. He was smoking his pipe and drinking sherry. He offered a glass to Rénine, who refused. "Well, Hortense," he said, in a rather thick voice, "you know that it's pretty dull here, except in these September days. You must make the most of them. Have you had a pleasant ride with Rénine?" "That's just what I wanted to talk about, my dear sir," interrupted the prince. "You must excuse me, but I have to go to the station in 10 minutes, to meet a friend of my wife's. Oh, 10 minutes will be ample. Just the time to smoke a cigarette? No longer." He took a cigarette from the case, which Monsieur d'Aigleroche handed to him, lit it and said: I must tell you that our ride happened to take us to an old domain which you are sure to know, the Domaine des Halingres. Certainly I know it, but it has been closed, boarded up for 25 years or so. You weren't able to get in, I suppose? Yes, we were. Really? Was it interesting? Extremely. We discovered the strangest things. What things? Asked the count, looking at his watch. Rénine described what they had seen. On a tower some way from the house there were two dead bodies, two skeletons rather, a man and a woman, still wearing the clothes which they had on when they were murdered. Come, come now, murdered? Yes, and that is what we have come to trouble you about. The tragedy must date back to some 20 years ago. Was nothing known of it at the time? Certainly not, declared the count. I never heard of any such crime or disappearance. Oh, really? Said Rénine, looking a little disappointed. I hoped to obtain a few particulars. I'm sorry. In that case, I apologize. He consulted Hortense with a glance and moved towards the door. But on second thought, could you not at least, my dear sir, bring me into touch with some persons in the neighbourhood, some members of your family, who might know more about it? Of my family? And why? Because the Domaine des Halingres used to belong, and no doubt still belongs, to the d'Aigleroches. The arms are an eagle on a heap of stones, on a rock. This at once suggested the connection. This time the count appeared surprised. He pushed back his decanter and his glass of sherry, and said, "What's this you're telling me? I had no idea that we had any such neighbours." Rénine shook his head and smiled. "I should be more inclined to believe, sir, that you were not very eager to admit any relationship between yourself and the unknown owner of the property." "Then he's not a respectable man?" "The man, to put it plainly, is a murderer." "What do you mean?" The count had risen from his chair. Hortense, greatly excited, said, "Are you really sure that there has been a murder, and that the murder was done by some one belonging to the house?" "Quite sure." "But why are you so certain?" "Because I know who the two victims were, and what caused them to be killed." Prince Rénine was making none but positive statements, and his method suggested the belief that he supported by the strongest proofs. M. d'Aigleroche strode up and down the room, with his hands behind his back. He ended by saying, "I always had an instinctive feeling that something had happened, but I never tried to find out. Now, as a matter of fact, 20 years ago, a relation of mine, a distant cousin, used to live at the Domaine des Halingres. I hoped, because of the name I bear, that this story, which, as I say, I never knew but suspected, would remain hidden forever. So this cousin killed somebody? Yes, he was obliged to." Rénine shook his head. "I'm sorry to have to amend that phrase, my dear sir. The truth, on the contrary, is that your cousin took his victims' lives in cold blood and in a cowardly manner. I never heard of a crime more deliberately and craftily planned. What is it that you know?" The moment had come for Rénine to explain himself, a solemn and anguish-stricken moment, the full gravity of which Hortense understood, though she had not yet divined any part of the tragedy which the prince unfolded step by step. "It's a very simple story," he said. "There is every reason to believe that M. d'Aigleroche was married, and that there was another couple living in the neighbourhood with whom the owner of the Domaine des Halingres were on friendly terms. What happened one day, which of these four persons first disturbed the relations between the two households, I am unable to say. But a likely version, which at once occurs to the mind, is that your cousin's wife, Madame d'Aigleroche, was in the habit of meeting the other husband in the ivy-covered tower, which had a door opening outside the estate. On discovering the intrigue, your cousin d'Aigleroche resolved to be revenged, but in such a manner that there should be no scandal, and that no one even should ever know that the guilty pair had been killed. Now he had ascertained, as I did just now, that there was a part of the house, the belvedere, from which you can see, over the trees in the undulations of the park, the tower standing 800 yards away, and that this was the only place that overlooked the top of the tower. He therefore pierced a hole in the parapet, through one of the former loopholes, and from there, by using a telescope which fitted exactly in the grove which he had hollowed out, he watched the meetings of the two lovers. And it was from there, also, that, after carefully taking all his measurements and calculating all his